Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining. We'll just give it a minute for folks to get connected, get their audio connected. Looks like we're just about at critical mass. Welcome, everyone. I'm Tim Carroll. I'm the Senior Press Secretary here at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. Appreciate everyone joining on a Tuesday afternoon. We are here to talk about permitting reform, which we are getting very excited about over here at C2ES. And I know everyone on this call has been very much engaged in the conversations as they've kind of kicked off on the Hill. So we've got a good panel here, and we are very much looking forward to taking questions afterwards. We are going to hear from our president, Nat Keohane, first, who will then turn it over to Jeremy from ClearPath, Jeremy Harrell from ClearPath, and then over to Jason Albritton from the Nature Conservancy. And then we will open it up for questions to all three speakers. Once we get to the questions part, if you could please use the raise hand function, and we will get to as many as we can. But with that, I will turn it over to Nat to kick us off.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tim. And thanks everybody for joining. I'm Nat Keohane, president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. I'm really excited about today's conversation and appreciate you all dialing in. So as many of you know, C2ES is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization committed to advancing climate and energy solutions and the technologies and policies to promote them. Core to our work is the conviction that smart, well-designed policies coupled with business action can accelerate the low carbon transition, grow the economy, and really build a more prosperous and resilient low carbon future. So we bring together, a lot of what we do is bring together folks from different perspectives, stakeholders from different perspectives to build support for sound energy and climate policy. And that's one reason I'm so glad to have ClearPath and TNC here. And have Jeremy and Jason joining. And as Tim said, we're going to want to share a little bit of the state of play around permitting reform and what's needed to pass reforms that are really critical to meeting the nation's energy and infrastructure demands. And I just want to set the stage a little bit before I turn it over to Jeremy. You know, our country's energy demand, in particular electricity demand, has been flat for several decades until just a few years ago. It used to be predictable and stagnant, and now it's rocketing upward as a result of onshoring manufacturing, electrification of the economy, including EVs, and particularly, of course, artificial intelligence, data centers, or as I've heard them increasingly discussed, data factories, AI factories. That mounting demand growth means we need to build additional generation and the transmission system to support it. We need to be building new facilities and new infrastructure, and we won't be able to meet the needs of the climate or the needs of the economy without that. And that means we won't be able to do that with the status quo we have right now on permitting. We need smart policy that makes it easier to build and distribute clean energy, which is in almost every instance, not only the most affordable, but the fastest to market method of energy production on the market today. If we make it easier to build things, the economic forces behind clean energy are going to win 9 times out of 10. That's a bet that I think climate hawks like us, like we are at C2ES, are willing to make for a future of abundant, affordable energy. But that bet hinges on smart, bipartisan permitting reform getting done this Congress. We came close in the last Congress, but ultimately were unable to advance a final permitting package. This time, we're seeing more members of Congress from both sides of the aisle who are willing to engage in permitting conversations. And we have key champions on both sides in both chambers who've signaled a willingness to pass meaningful bipartisan legislation. We can talk more in the Q&A about what the politics look like in detail. But at C2S, we're working closely with members, committees, and caucuses on the Hill. People like Representatives Dusty Johnson of South Dakota and Scott Peters of California, the House Natural Resources Committee, and others in the Senate, all of whom are actively involved in putting workable policies on the table for debate. We're especially thrilled by the broad support for the E-Permit Act, which we've been very involved in, which would create a cohesive system across the federal government to speed up reviews, enhance accessibility, provide project transparency, and in result, speed up the process and save taxpayer dollars, all by putting things online, making the process digital. We've also been encouraged by bipartisan nature of other permitting reform and transmission bills, excuse me, such as the Speed and Reliability Act and the Speed Act, the legislative platform, as well announced by the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus. So there's a lot happening. There's a lot of work ahead to reach consensus, but the introduction of those proposals is a good start, and we think reflective of a political environment where a deal is possible. That's why we're working with those champions on the Hill. And that's why we're working with folks like Jeremy at ClearPath and Jason at TNC and their teams, and with companies like those on our Business Environmental Leadership Council to keep this momentum going. We know there are other things going on in Congress right now. We know there are a lot of other things happening, but we think permitting reform is something that needs to happen and can happen with the right ingredients. We're developing a set of policy recommendations to help inform the debate and really achieve long-lasting permitting reform that meets our needs and meets the growing demand for electricity while lowering costs for families across the country. This is not going to be easy. I don't want to we don't want to pretend that we've sort of got this in the bag, but it is necessary. And that's why we think it's so important to keep the focus on this. We do see paths forward for progress. We've got a lot of work ahead, but we think there's an opportunity to capitalize on that. So I'm really proud to have and happy to have Jeremy and Jason on as partners in this effort. And Jason, sorry, Jeremy, let me turn it to you first.
Yeah, thank you, Nat, and thanks to the C2S team for hosting this, and appreciate each of your all's partnership on what we think is the single largest barrier to the U.S. leading on energy development, energy security, and climate action. And to Nat's point, I think the only way that we're going to have the regulatory predictability necessary to meet those challenges is bipartisan action. We need a regulatory system that's predictable, not just today, for the next 20 years. And bipartisan, politically durable policy is the only way we're going to achieve that goal, which I could not agree more with Nat, is a practical necessity as we look to grow the American economy, further U.S. influence globally, and ultimately reduce emissions not only here, but at home. I couldn't agree more on I think if we put in a technology agnostic solution forward here, that clean energy is going to win 9 out of 10 times here in the US. And I think that's instrumental to the US global picture. So ClearPath, its vision is that the US is going to lead not only as an early actor, but also as a technology provider to the world. And so scaling these technologies here at home is what's going to contribute to the global emissions footprint. Real briefly before I get into the politics, for those of you who may not be familiar with ClearPath, so ClearPath and ClearPath Action, C3 and C4 organizations that work on conservative organizations that work on clean energy and climate policy. Our mission is to accelerate technological innovations to reduce global emissions. So we're thinking about how do we scale technologies here at home, things like advanced nuclear, enhanced geothermal, energy storage, grid infrastructure, renewables, as well as how do we scale other products like building blocks of the economy, like low carbon cement, concrete, fertilizer, to really grow and drive American supply chains and ultimately drive the global emissions picture. We work very closely with leaders on Capitol Hill, Republicans and Democrats closely, as well as the administration on pragmatic policy solutions that we think drive towards those goals. And we do it by trying to come up with the deep policy analysis and data behind policy ideas to provide policymakers the polling, message testing about how to talk about these issues, not only here in DC, but back at home, build bipartisan coalitions to get them across the finish line, and then ultimately ClearPath Action, our C4 organization, work to navigate it to fruition. And now is the time for this policy suite. I think the combination of 4 key factors make that clear, and why we're optimistic that while, yes, it's going to be hard, there's an imperative for Congress to come together here in the next 18 months and get a bill across the finish line. One, the political volatility we've seen across administrations, frankly, the last 12 years. More and more we're seeing political transition put difference of approaches to the regulatory system, dramatic shifts in how they approach the system. And so we need to, from a U.S. competitiveness standpoint, restore more predictability. Two, I think Nat laid out very clearly the demand growth scenario. There's an imperative for the U.S. to be able to deploy faster. We're in a race with China on AI. We're in a race with China on manufacturing. We're in a race with China with things like space technology and others that will be significantly energy intensive. And so there's a national security imperative to act here. The AI race, I think, is third and really drives a lot of this action. Like, I think that is an area where you see Republicans and Democrats coming together closely. You're seeing the administration have that layered in literally every executive action that they take. And that competition is really instrumental moving forward in how the U.S. is going to position itself. We're in a leading position now, but we'll cede that leadership without more aggressive action. And then lastly is the judicial side of this. We've seen some significant court rulings over really the last decade, but in particular the last 12 months that inject some additional uncertainty into how the system is approached. The Chevron case sticks out. 7 counties, obviously one that's dealing with NEPA. That kind of judicial overlay really merits Congress coming in with some bipartisan action and establishing predictability. So those are some really key drivers here. As we think about it, I testified in the House Natural Resources Committee on a couple of the bills that Nat just mentioned earlier about 3 weeks ago, the SPEED Act and the E-Permit Act, 2 bills that ClearPath Action is also supporting. We think the E-Permit Act is a no-brainer first step move to really modernize the system and really put in a more transparent approach that will drive transparency across the federal government and that will support federal, state, and local efforts. Some of the initial moves by the House, I think, set the stage for where negotiations could be. And I really want to underscore one of the items that Nat pointed out, the bipartisan problem solvers proposal that came out a couple weeks ago. Beyond the nitty-gritty details of it, it kind of lays out a bigger outline of what a deal could look like, some significant policy reforms on linear infrastructure, both on the transmission side as well as on Clean Water Act compliance for pipelines. There are NEPA components in that bill, judicial reform, and some other targeted reforms that could be helpful to catalyzing individual technologies as well. And so you're starting to see a little more consensus around the outlines of what this could look like. And that's been supported by Senator Whitehouse, the lead Democrat on the Environment and Public Works Committee, and Senator Capito, before the top Republican on the Environment and Public Works Committee, continuing to beat the drum that they see this as the top priority in how they want to push forward. So we're cautiously optimistic. There is a lot of work to be done here, and we're looking forward to working with partners like C2ES, many of our private sector players who are going to be instrumental to the actual deployment of these technologies, and key NGO partners like the Nature Conservancy who want to solve problems and really establish that predictability in the regulatory system that we not only need today, but for the next 20 years for the US to be competitive and to drive global climate action. Jason, I'll turn it over to you next.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. And just wanted to start by saying thanks to Nat and C2ES for pulling this conversation together. It's a really important topic. Just a quick bit of background. I'm Jason Albritton, Director of the North America Climate Program for the Nature Conservancy. We're a global conservation organization. We work in all 50 US states and 70 countries around the world. We're nonpartisan, and we focus on 2 big issues of addressing biodiversity loss and climate change, which is one of the biggest threats that is confronting nature at this time. So that's how we kind of come to this issue. So I want to start a little bit with, why does TNC care about permitting reform? First, we believe that smarter permitting will enable communities and nature to continue thriving while helping the nation address really important issues like the growing energy demand that you heard both Nat and Jeremy talk about, addressing climate change, and from our perspective, restoring and enhancing resiliency of our natural and working lands. So I want to dig into each of those in a little bit of detail to just show how we think about this issue and how we think permitting reform can really provide some great benefits. So we've all talked about energy demand. It's growing. Everybody knows that. Some projections say that to meet this growing demand by 2040, we'll have to build over 1,000 gigawatts of new energy generation in this country. And just to put that in a little bit of perspective, a large-scale solar or wind farm, utility-scale project can be roughly a gigawatt. So 1,000 of those in the next few years to be built. That's a really daunting challenge. The good news is that we're in the midst of an energy transition in this country. We have more options available to us than ever before, and a growing number of those options that are very viable and cost effective are clean sources of energy. So that's good for the climate, it's good for energy security, and it's good for economic competitiveness in our country. So we really have an opportunity there. We also know, and my previous speakers, colleagues here also mentioned that we need to really expand transmission infrastructure in this country, the power lines that carry the energy from where it's generated to where it's used. We also need to invest in the grid, deploy new technologies that help modernize our electric grid. These are critical not only to meet the demand growth, but also to maintain reliability and affordability and integrate more clean energy onto our electric grid, all important goals. And then the last one I'll mention, which is one that the Nature Conservancy cares about, there's an equally pressing need for conservation and ecosystem restoration and land management projects that benefit wildlife habitat, benefit forests, benefit waterways. And these projects, which can often be large, expensive, and timely projects, really help communities become more resilient and contribute to economic growth, particularly the outdoor recreation economy that contributes about $862 billion annually to our national economy. The problem is that while we know we need all these great projects, is that the approval and deployment timelines could be much faster. For renewable energy projects, the average review timeline, according to the American Clean Power Association, is roughly 4.5 years. For transmission projects, the average is 6.5 years, but often the largest, most complex lines that cross multiple states can take well over 10 years. And this is just simply too long. We're not going to meet our goals and address some of these challenges if we don't change this timeline for deployment. And we really believe that improving our system for planning and permitting will help projects be completed at a pace that matches the scale of the need. And whether that's meeting energy demand, keeping up momentum on the clean energy expansion, improving reliability and affordability for customers, and protecting and restoring ecosystems, all of those require urgent action. And improving planning and permitting processes really can contribute to faster, better, and more informed decisions. And then I think if done right, and that's a point I want to emphasize, that it is important to get this right, and it's not guaranteed because we really do have to focus on the details. Permitting modernization can reduce conflicts, it can accelerate project timelines, and lead to better outcomes for communities and conservation. And that's what we really want to see out of the discussions that are happening right now. You already heard about some of the bills that are out there right now, so I won't go into them again, but we really do think there's some really good ideas being put on the table, that they could be impactful and really move the needle on delivering projects in a better way. And we have to craft legislation carefully to both accelerate project timelines while avoiding unintended consequences. TNC as an organization has identified permitting modernization as a really promising lever for advancing projects more efficiently. And we really appreciate the robust and bipartisan conversation. And that's an important point, too, that others have emphasized. It's really important that this is a bipartisan conversation, but we're really glad to see that happening. We've put a lot of thought into this topic. We released a white paper last year with a whole menu of permitting reforms across a range of technologies. And so, we've been committed to this a long time, and we'll remain committed as we hope we can see it through in Congress. We really welcome the opportunity to contribute to what I think is a very pragmatic and productive conversation so far in Congress, and hopefully we can move this forward and get it across the finish line soon. So with that, I'll turn it back over, and I really look forward to the questions that all of you may have.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks to all our speakers. And I already see some hands up, but we'll just remind folks if they could please use the raise hand function, and we will get into as many questions as we can in the remaining few minutes here. Chuck from Axios, why don't we kick it off with you?
Hi, Chuck McCutcheon with Axios. Thanks again for holding this. Despite the bipartisanship, we're about to have a government shutdown, it looks like tomorrow. How concerned are all of you that this could poison the well in terms of getting anything accomplished?
Let me take a quick stab, and then Jeremy, I'm sure you'll want to jump in. I just want to say maybe something. I think, Chuck, that's a great question, and also about the politics in general. I think from our perspective, look, I mean, obviously the government shutdown is on everyone's mind right now, and we'll see how Congress gets through that. From our perspective, the ingredients are there on Capitol Hill for a deal, and I think part of what you're seeing is I think you frankly had probably Republicans have been in the position of thinking that permitting reform is a good idea for a while. And I think you've seen Democrats come on and say, we really need this to build the kind of modern energy infrastructure that we need to meet all the challenges that we've all been talking about. And so I think we really are seeing, despite everything, despite the other issues, right, we are seeing, I think, a real willingness among key folks, many of whom we've mentioned, to work together. I think, frankly, to be totally candid, one of the challenges is any deal is going to have to be even-handed. It's going to have to be across the board, basically a level playing field that doesn't put the thumb on the scale for, the technologies that one party or the other likes. That's the only way we're going to get bipartisan reform. As I said, from a climate hawk perspective, we think you do that, clean energy wins. That's why we're willing to take the bet. But I think it's going to have to be a level playing field. And that's kind of the sticking point right now, not within Congress, but I think concerns that folks have about whether something would be implemented in a even-handed way by the executive, by the administration. And so one of the key areas to be watching that we're involved in, I know others are thinking about, is what are ways you can kind of future-proof the legislation to make sure that congressional intent is frankly respected by any future administration. So I see that more as, there'll be a lot of hubbub around the government shutdown, but I think Congress at some point is going to need to get back to work. I think this is something where we have the ingredients, but that's kind of the key hurdle we're going to need to overcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with Nat and say this too shall pass. I think in July, after the one big beautiful bill got across the finish line, you heard a lot of folks saying, well, I don't know if we can get past this moment to continue the permitting conversations. And we saw an influx of activity over the last month and a half. I think that will likely be the case as well on reconciliation. And then I want to underscore like three political dynamics of why I think now is the time. Two are congressional and one is executive branch related. So the two congressional ones, one would be, it's now clear reconciliation and a go it alone is not a feasible pathway. We saw Democrats, particularly Senator Manchin, try this with the IRA and hit a brick wall with the parliamentarian on the Senate side, and then very clearly saw in the OB3 fight where Republicans thought they had learned some of the lessons that Manchin had gone through there and went a different tact on it. And effectively, 95% of the things related to regulatory reform were jettisoned by the parliamentarian out of the House passed bill into the Senate. So kind of underscores that the one party go at it alone is not feasible, let alone do we need bipartisan congressional action to ensure that there's political durability on it. And two, on the congressional side, I think a couple inside baseball things that I think that are worth flagging. Senator Whitehouse, who is the top Democrat on the Environment, Public and Works Committee, stated publicly about a month ago that he's going to take the judiciary gavel after Durbin leaves the Senate, Senator Durbin is retiring. So that means this is his kind of 2-year moment as the top Democrat at the Environment and Public Works Committee to have a legacy item. And I think we've heard clearly from him on the Senate floor and in hearings like this, he sees this as a climate imperative. So he's motivated. And then, as you may know, Republicans, particularly on the House side, have term limits on their chairmanships. And so Chairman Westerman at Natural Resources, who's been in the thick of this, been trying to find bipartisan paths forward, dating back to even the EPR deal last year, is kind of in his last 2-year stint to get a legacy item over the finish line. So they both are particularly vested in getting a deal across. And then the third is on the administration side, and I think this comes twofold. One, I think this administration is already seeing the limits to their executive action. I think they've made some moves that are productive to drive new energy investment forward, and some that I think we could have a debate about. But they know that there are limits to what they can do on the administrative side, and particularly in some of the areas like the judicial side, they need congressional action. And then I heard this loud and clear from members when I testified at House Resources a couple of weeks ago, particularly from Democratic members. They want to put some sideboards on executive branch action, regardless of who's the president, but certainly in this moment as well. And so I think there is a compromise to come together there that syncs with both Republicans and Democrats' goals to grow American energy and improve low carbon deployment here in the U.S.
Thanks, Chuck. And thanks both. Let's go over to Rick from Inside EPA.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Okay, all right, sorry about that. a little bit more on bipartisanship. You mentioned a couple of different bills here. So when Chairman Westerman and Golden introduced their bill at the committee, Ranking Member Huffman slammed the proposal as taking a sledgehammer to NEPA. So how do you overcome that? And I understand what you're talking about in terms of it's right for the moment, the limits that the administration is experiencing, and some of the term limit issues and levy issues. But beyond that, like, how do you overcome that kind of a divide right now? Is there any proposal out there that could garner that kind of bipartisan support? Or are we thinking about a whole new bill? And also, what are we talking about in terms of process? Are we looking at a number of bills that will be combined in one package or a single bill?
Maybe I can say something really quick off the top. Jason, you probably have the best angle on NEPA, and Jeremy, you may have the right idea, the idea and offsets. Rick, look, I think it's a good question, and obviously Representative Huffman has made his views known. I guess the data point I would look to, just in terms of like, are the politics really changing enough on this? And I think this is on the Democratic side where we've seen that concern around NEPA. I think the data point I would point to is California actually, and the fact that the California legislature, as you know, Democratic supermajority, Democratic governor, not only passed reform of the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, but did so in very public fashion, and the world didn't end. Now that was about housing. That was a fight that was focused on housing. But I look at that and I say that's a sign that I think the politics around this are changing, in terms of some of the folks on the left who have had concerns around this, and they're changing because people realize we need to build more. We need to build more energy. We need to build more housing in the case of California. So that's a general point, and obviously, that's California legislature. But I think that's a sign that the politics are changing. But Jason, you would have a better sense of some of the details.
Yeah, a couple things I would add here, and you asked about one piece of legislation. We're in the stage where a lot of different members are putting forward proposals, and what's introduced is not going to be the final negotiated piece of legislation. But I think the good news is that there's a lot of interest and there's a desire to have that negotiation and get to something that both sides can live with. And I think that's where we are in this process, is that conversation. I would also point out some other legislative proposals that are out there, and others have already mentioned it, but the Problem Solvers Caucus, framework. I think that's a really good model for where we could go and some of the things that we think could get broad bipartisan agreement. I mean, that's already, endorsed by dozens of members on both sides of the aisle. That's a great start. Last Congress, we got very close with a bipartisan agreement with Senator Manchin and Barrasso. They got, not all across the finish line, but pretty close, that had a lot of good elements of policy that I think can get broad support. So we know that there are reforms out there that can get that kind of broad support. It's going to be a negotiation. There's going to have to be trade-offs, but I think the willingness to have that negotiation and find those solutions is the really encouraging thing about where we are right now.
The only thing that I would add there, couldn't agree more, and I think not one of these proposals is what's going to get enacted into law. It's important that a lot of them are coming across the finish line, or a lot of them being put forth. A lot of them are bipartisan. But you even saw in the hearing on the SPEED Act, where Huffman, certainly Chairman Huffman or Ranking Member Huffman, was aggressively attacking the bill. And certainly other members on his side of the dais were attacking it, but most of them started their statements and questions with, I want to get to yes. I know that this is a problem and we've got to find a way to restore some predictability. So I think there's a lot of interest on both sides of the aisle coming together and compromising here.
If I can add actually one more point, sorry to come in on the tail end, and I know we're a little over time, but Rick, it's such a good question. I would also point at, I agree with everything that Jason and Jeremy just said, but I would point to something else that maybe is not immediately obvious, but once you start thinking about it, which is some of these pieces that are out there, I think, and I'm not going to make a prediction about, do we get rifle shots or do we get one big thing? But you start thinking about some of them, I think, are really complementarity and maybe open up other room for negotiation and for deal making that didn't appear right away. And my favorite example of that is that e-permit act. You look at that on its face, Jeremy said it's like a no-brainer. Of course we should modernize the system, and of course it should be digital. And that all seems like a no-brainer. And in some ways it feels like that's just like an e-filing thing. But once you start thinking about the implications of having that kind of transparency, what that opens up in terms of, frankly, real community engagement and stakeholder engagement, what that opens up for in terms of transparency about timing and when the clock starts, you can start to see pathways to address some of the traditional concerns that folks have had. For example, on the left. So just to take one example, right? If you have a very transparent platform that tells everybody when the clock starts on the permitting process, it actually becomes easier to have a conversation with folks about why you can't have 150 or 180 or 120 day limit on that. Right now, everything's so opaque. You don't know what's happening, and one reason people don't want a limit is because they're worried they'll never find out about the project until the limit's almost up. And so that's just one example where I think you start thinking about new and fresh ideas, and you have the opportunity to change some of the dynamic and some of the politics in ways that maybe opens up pathways that didn't seem like they were available before.
Thanks, Nat. Thanks, everybody. I know that we're a little bit over time, so I think we will wrap it up there. I just want to say thank you again to all the reporters that joined. Thank you again to all of our speakers for joining us. This is, I think, the first of many conversations that we are looking to have out of C2ES, but of course with our partners as well on the state of permitting reform as it moves forward. Even as the possibility of a shutdown looms, we will be in touch. If we didn't get to a question today, or you have any other thoughts, comments, or questions, we are happy to take those offline. And I think everyone on this call has my email. But until our next conversation, we'll say thank you again to everyone for joining, and we will be in touch.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody, for your time.
Thanks.